Imagine spending 3 years behind bars for a murder you didn't commit. 3 years of your life stolen. Your family gone. Your reputation destroyed. And all the while, the real killer is out there, living freely, walking the same streets, breathing the same air as the victim's grieving family. Now imagine that same killer, comfortable in his ordinary life, confident he'd gotten away with it, suddenly finding himself face to face with detectives 22 years later. 22 years of freedom, about to come crashing down because of a discarded water bottle and a science that didn't even exist when he committed his crime. This is the story of Karen Umphrey, a 21-year-old woman whose life was brutally cut short on a November night in Port Huron, Michigan. It's the story of Calvin Hayes, an innocent man whose life was shattered by a wrongful conviction. And it's the story of Douglas Laming, who thought he'd buried his secret forever, until forensic genealogy dug it back up and brought it screaming into the light. This is a cold case that haunted a community for over 2 decades, a case that exposed the dangerous flaws in our justice system, and a case that ultimately proved that no matter how much time passes, the truth has a way of refusing to stay buried. This is the story of how one of Michigan's most troubling cold cases was finally, after 22 years, solved in a way that shocked everyone who thought they knew what really happened that terrible night in 2001. Let me introduce you to Karen Umphrey, 21 years old in the fall of 2001, living in Port Huron, Michigan, a small city nestled right on the border of the United States and Canada, where the St. Clair River flows into Lake Huron. Port Huron is the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where neighbors look out for each other, where young people grow up dreaming about their futures. Karen was exactly that kind of young woman. She wasn't famous. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't trying to change the world. She was just trying to live her life, figure out who she was, and enjoy being 21. Friends described her as bright, full of energy, the kind of person who could light up a room just by walking into it. She had that infectious personality that drew people to her, that made people want to be around her. She worked, she hung out with friends, she had a boyfriend named Fred Hill. Their relationship was like a lot of young relationships, full of passion and occasional arguments, the normal drama of 2 people trying to navigate love in their early 20s. She had family who adored her, parents who worried about her the way all parents worry about their daughters, siblings who looked up to her. Karen loved going out, being social, celebrating life's moments with the people she cared about. She was the kind of friend who would show up for you, who would be there for your big moments, who would dance with you at your bachelorette party and make sure you had the best night of your life. And that's exactly what she was doing on the night of November 9th, 2001. She was attending a bachelorette party for a friend, celebrating, laughing, living her life the way 21-year-olds do. She was wearing jeans, a comfortable shirt, ready for a fun night out. The party was good, the kind of evening where you forget about your troubles and just enjoy being young and alive. As the night wound down, Karen said her goodbyes. She walked out to her car, a green Buick Century, nothing fancy, just reliable transportation that got her where she needed to go. She climbed into the driver's seat, probably thinking about her bed, maybe thinking about the argument she'd had with Fred earlier that evening, maybe replaying moments from the party in her mind. She turned the key in the ignition. The engine started. She pulled out of the parking lot and headed home, following the familiar route through Port Huron streets. It was late, but not dangerously so. This was her town, her community, a place where she felt safe. But Karen Umphrey would never make it home that night. Somewhere between that bachelorette party and her front door, something terrible happened. Someone stopped her, or maybe she stopped for someone. Someone who saw her not as a person, not as a daughter or a friend or a young woman with dreams and plans and people who loved her, but as an opportunity, as a victim, as something to be used and discarded. Karen's last moments on this earth were filled with terror. She was taken from her car, from her life, from everything she knew and everyone who loved her. She was sexually assaulted, violated in the worst way imaginable. And then, as if that wasn't enough, as if destroying her life wasn't sufficient, her attacker shot her. Not once, but twice. 2 bullets to the head, execution style, ensuring she could never identify him, never tell anyone what he'd done, never get justice. The vibrant young woman who'd been dancing and laughing at a bachelorette party just hours earlier was now lying dead in the woods, discarded like trash. Her life stolen at 21 years old. She never got to turn 22. She never got to figure out if Fred was the one. She never got to see what she might become, who she might grow into, what dreams she might achieve. Karen Umphrey's life ended that night, but her story, her fight for justice, was only just beginning. And it would take over 2 decades, countless hours of investigation, one wrongful conviction, and revolutionary science to finally bring her killer to justice. The first alarm bells started ringing the next morning, November 10, 2001. Karen hadn't come home. Now, for a 21-year-old, staying out all night might not be unusual under different circumstances, but this was different. Karen's family knew something was wrong. They could feel it in their bones, that terrible parental instinct that tells you when your child is in danger. They started making phone calls, to friends, to Fred, to anyone who might have seen her, might know where she was. Each call brought more worry, more fear, because nobody had seen Karen since she left that party. She'd said goodnight, gotten in her car, and seemingly vanished into thin air. Then came the discovery that turned worry into full-blown panic. Karen's green Buick Century was found abandoned. The car was there, but Karen wasn't. This wasn't a case of a young woman staying out too late or forgetting to call home. This was something far more sinister. The Port Huron police were immediately notified, and a search began. Officers fanned out across the area, looking for any sign of the missing young woman. Friends and family joined in, walking the streets, calling her name, hoping against hope that this was all some terrible misunderstanding, that Karen would turn up with some reasonable explanation. But deep down, everyone knew. When someone disappears from their car, when a vehicle is found abandoned with no explanation, the outcome is rarely good. The question wasn't whether something bad had happened. The question was what exactly and where Karen could be found. The answer came far too quickly, and it was far worse than anyone had dared imagine. Karen's body was discovered in the Beards Hills State Game Area, a wooded recreational area just outside Port Huron. She was found lying in the brush, partially concealed, left there like she was nothing, like her life had no value. The scene was horrific. The medical examination would later reveal the full extent of what had been done to her. Sexual assault, 2 gunshot wounds to the head. This wasn't a crime of passion, not in the traditional sense. This was predatory, calculated, brutal. Someone had taken Karen, used her, and then executed her to eliminate the witness to his crime. When news spread through Port Huron, the community went into collective shock. This kind of thing didn't happen here. Sure, every town has its problems, its occasional violence, but this level of brutality, this kind of predatory sexual homicide, this was the stuff of big city crime stories, not small-town Michigan. Parents immediately tightened their grip on their daughters. Women stopped walking alone at night. The sense of safety that had defined Port Huron evaporated overnight. There was a killer out there, someone who could do this, someone who might do it again. And nobody knew who it was. The pressure on law enforcement was immediate and intense. The community demanded answers. Karen's family, drowning in grief, needed justice. The media descended on Port Huron, turning a local tragedy into regional news. Every day that passed without an arrest felt like another failure. Another moment where the killer was free and Karen's death remained unavenged. For the investigators, the crime scene told a story, but it was a story with missing chapters. There was evidence, certainly. Physical evidence from the sexual assault. Shell casings from the murder weapon. The location where the body was found. Karen's abandoned car. Each piece was important, each could potentially lead to the killer, but how did they all fit together? Who had done this, and how had he gotten away? The investigation was about to kick into high gear, driven by public outrage, family grief, and the determination of detectives who were willing to do whatever it took to bring Karen's killer to justice. But that determination, that desire to solve the case quickly and give the community the closure it desperately needed, was about to lead the investigation down a path that would create a second victim, a second tragedy, and a miscarriage of justice that would haunt Port Huron for years to come. The Port Huron Police Department and the Michigan State Police joined forces immediately. This was all hands on deck, the kind of case where every available resource gets thrown at the investigation. Detectives began by doing what detectives always do, working the case from the inside out, starting with the people closest to Karen. First up was Fred Hill, Karen's boyfriend. In any homicide investigation, romantic partners are always scrutinized, and for good reason. Statistics show that when a woman is murdered, the perpetrator is most often someone she knows, often intimately. Fred and Karen had argued the night she disappeared. That argument, combined with his proximity to the victim, made him an immediate person of interest. Detectives brought Fred in for questioning. They pressed him hard about the argument, about his whereabouts that night, about his relationship with Karen. But as they dug deeper, as they verified his alibi and checked his story against the physical evidence, Fred was quickly cleared. Whatever had happened between him and Karen that night, whatever words had been exchanged, Fred Hill hadn't killed her. The evidence didn't support it, his alibi held up, and his genuine grief was apparent to everyone who interviewed him. So if it wasn't the boyfriend, who was it? The answer came from an eyewitness, someone who had been in the area where Karen's car was found, someone who had seen something that night, something that would become the single most critical lead in the entire investigation. This witness reported seeing a dark-colored pickup truck near the location where Karen's car was abandoned. The detail that made this report significant was specific. The truck was missing its rear bumper. It was a distinctive detail, the kind of thing that separates a vague description from an actionable lead. Investigators now had something concrete to look for, a vehicle description they could work with. The detectives began canvassing the area, looking for anyone who owned a dark pickup truck missing its rear bumper. They checked vehicle registrations, talked to residents, showed up at doors asking questions. This was old-fashioned police work, the kind of grinding, methodical investigation that solves cases. And then they found him, Calvin Hayes, a local mill worker, 35 years old, a man with no significant criminal history, just an ordinary guy working an ordinary job. But Calvin Hayes owned a truck, and while it wasn't exactly what the witness described, it was close enough to catch the detective's attention, close enough to make him a suspect. Investigators descended on Calvin Hayes's life. They examined his vehicle thoroughly, looking for any evidence that Karen had been in or near it. They found boot prints near where Karen's body had been discovered, and they matched them to boots that Calvin Hayes owned. The prints weren't conclusive on their own, but combined with the truck, they created a pattern, a narrative that was starting to take shape in the investigators' minds. Then came the polygraph examination. Polygraphs, commonly known as lie detector tests, are controversial in law enforcement and inadmissible in most courts, but they're still used as investigative tools, ways to apply pressure to suspects and evaluate their responses. Calvin Hayes agreed to take a polygraph, and according to the examiner, he failed. But here's where the case against Calvin Hayes gets complicated, where the mistakes start piling up, where tunnel vision begins to blind investigators to alternative possibilities. When first questioned, Calvin Hayes lied about where he was the night Karen disappeared. He said he'd been out raccoon hunting alone, a story that didn't check out and couldn't be verified. Under pressure, Hayes changed his story. He admitted he'd lied, but not because he'd murdered Karen Umphrey. He'd lied because he was having an affair. He was with a woman named Lorraine Gray that night, and he'd lied to protect both of them from the social consequences of their infidelity. It was a lie born of embarrassment and fear of judgment, not guilt for murder. But by this point, investigators were convinced they had their man. The truck, similar to the witness description. The boot prints at the scene. The failed polygraph. The initial lie about his whereabouts. Each piece of evidence, viewed through the lens of Hayes's guilt, seemed to confirm it. This is what investigators call tunnel vision, when you become so convinced of a suspect's guilt that you stop looking for evidence that might contradict your theory and start only seeing evidence that confirms it. Detectives didn't adequately investigate Calvin Hayes's new alibi. They didn't thoroughly interview Lorraine Gray, the woman who could have confirmed Hayes's story. They didn't consider that the boot print might be a common brand worn by thousands of people. They didn't question whether the witness's description of the truck was accurate enough to justify building an entire case around a vehicle that didn't exactly match. Instead, they moved forward with prosecution. The evidence was circumstantial, certainly, but prosecutors felt it was sufficient. In 2002, just months after Karen Umphrey's murder, Calvin Hayes was charged with her killing. The community breathed a collective sigh of relief. They had their man. Justice would be served. Karen's family could begin to heal, knowing her killer was behind bars. The trial was relatively swift. The prosecution presented the boot prints, the truck connection, the failed polygraph, the initial lie about raccoon hunting. They painted a picture of a guilty man, a man who had seen an opportunity, who had abducted and murdered Karen Umphrey, and who had tried to cover his tracks with a convenient lie about an affair. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that boot prints weren't unique identifiers, that polygraphs aren't reliable, that lying about an affair doesn't make someone a murderer. But in a community desperate for justice, in a courtroom where emotions ran high, the defense's arguments didn't resonate strongly enough. The jury deliberated. They weighed the evidence. They came back with their verdict: guilty. Calvin Hayes was convicted of the murder of Karen Umphrey and sentenced to 40 years to life in prison. He would spend decades behind bars, removed from society, paying for a horrific crime. Everyone believed justice had been served. The prosecutors congratulated each other. The investigators felt vindicated. Karen's family, while still grieving, had the closure of knowing her killer was locked away. The community of Port Huron returned to some semblance of normalcy, the fear that had gripped them finally beginning to ease. But there was one person who knew the truth, who knew that justice had not been served, that an innocent man was in prison while the real killer remained free. That person was Calvin Hayes himself, sitting in a cell, proclaiming his innocence, knowing that the woman he'd been with that night could prove he didn't kill Karen Umphrey, and wondering why nobody would listen. Calvin Hayes spent 3 years in prison. 3 years of his life, locked away for a crime he didn't commit. Imagine waking up every morning behind bars, knowing you're innocent, knowing the truth, but being completely powerless to prove it. Imagine watching your family fall apart, your marriage crumble, your reputation destroyed, all while the person who actually committed the murder walks free. For 3 years, Hayes maintained his innocence. He filed appeals. He wrote letters. He tried every avenue available to him to make someone, anyone, listen. And finally, someone did. In 2005, Lorraine Gray, the woman Calvin Hayes claimed to have been with the night of Karen's murder, came forward. She'd been silent during the trial, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of shame, perhaps not fully understanding the gravity of what was happening. But 3 years of knowing an innocent man was in prison finally became too much for her conscience to bear. Lorraine Gray told the truth. Yes, she'd been with Calvin Hayes that night. Yes, he was with her when Karen Umphrey was murdered. It wasn't raccoon hunting that had kept Hayes out late. It was their affair, their secret relationship, the kind of indiscretion that destroys marriages but doesn't make someone a murderer. To back up her testimony, Lorraine Gray submitted to a polygraph examination. She passed. The same technology that had been used to help convict Hayes now indicated that his alibi witness was telling the truth. Suddenly, the entire case against Calvin Hayes collapsed like a house of cards. The legal system had no choice but to respond. Hayes's conviction was overturned. The judge, faced with new evidence that created reasonable doubt, ruled that Calvin Hayes could not be held responsible for Karen Umphrey's murder. In 2005, after 3 years behind bars, Calvin Hayes walked out of prison a free man. But freedom is a relative term. Calvin Hayes was released from prison, yes, but he wasn't free, not really. His life had been destroyed. His wife had left him, taking their children, unable or unwilling to stand by a man convicted of such a heinous crime. His reputation in Port Huron was in tatters. Neighbors who once greeted him with friendly waves now looked at him with suspicion and fear. Employers who might have hired him saw only the murder conviction, not the exoneration. The financial cost was staggering. Legal fees had drained whatever savings he had. 3 years of lost income, of missed opportunities, of a career derailed, had left him nearly destitute. The psychological trauma of wrongful imprisonment, of being labeled a murderer, of losing everything and everyone he loved, would haunt him for the rest of his life. For Karen Umphrey's family, the exoneration was devastating in a completely different way. For 3 years, They'd believed justice had been served. They'd believed the man who killed their daughter was behind bars, paying for his crime. They'd been able to visit Karen's grave and tell her that her murderer was locked away, that she could rest in peace. Now, suddenly, that peace was shattered. Calvin Hayes' exoneration meant only one thing. Karen's real killer was still out there. The man who had sexually assaulted her, who had shot her twice in the head and left her body in the woods, had never been caught. He'd been free this entire time, living his life, while an innocent man rotted in prison and Karen's family clung to false closure. The case was reopened, but the trail was ice cold. 5 years had passed since Karen's murder. Memories fade. Evidence degrades. Witnesses move away or die. Leads that might have been promising in 2001 were now dead ends in 2005. Investigators went back to the beginning, re-examining everything with fresh eyes. They looked at the physical evidence again. They re-interviewed witnesses. They followed up on tips that had come in over the years but had been ignored once Calvin Hayes was convicted. One particular tip stood out, a cryptic piece of information that had been sitting in the case file gathering dust. A slip of paper with a name scrawled on it. Jasper Crowley. Someone, at some point, had given this name to investigators as a possible lead. But when detectives tried to track down Jasper Crowley, they hit a wall. The name led nowhere. They couldn't find anyone by that name connected to Karen, to Port Huron, to anything relevant to the case. Was Jasper Crowley a real person? An alias? A red herring? A mistake in spelling or transcription? Nobody knew, and without more information, there was no way to pursue it. The name Jasper Crowley became just another dead end in a case that was full of them. Months turned into years. 2006 became 2007, then 2008. The case file got thicker with dead-end leads and exhausted possibilities. The active investigation slowly wound down, not because anyone wanted to give up, but because there simply wasn't anywhere left to go with the available evidence and technology. Karen Umphrey's case became what investigators dread: a cold case. The file was moved to the cold case unit, where it joined hundreds of other unsolved homicides, cases where the trail had gone cold, where the answers remained frustratingly out of reach. A detective might pull it out every few years, review it, see if any new information had come to light, but there were no breakthroughs, no new leads, no justice. For Karen's family, the pain never diminished. They held on to hope that someday, somehow, someone would solve their daughter's murder. They attended cold case vigils. They kept in touch with investigators. They never stopped loving Karen, never stopped missing her, never stopped wanting the person who took her from them to face consequences. Calvin Hayes, meanwhile, tried to rebuild his shattered life. He found work where he could. He tried to reconnect with his children. He lived with the stigma of a wrongful conviction, knowing that many people in Port Huron still believed he was guilty, still whispered about him, still looked at him with suspicion. The exoneration might have freed him from prison, but it didn't free him from the conviction's lingering shadow. And somewhere in Port Huron, or perhaps having moved away, the real killer lived with his secret. Had he followed the case? Had he breathed a sigh of relief when Calvin Hayes was convicted, thinking he'd gotten away with murder? Did he feel any guilt, any remorse, any humanity at all? Or did he simply move on with his life, confident that enough time had passed, that the evidence was too old, that he was safe? For 15 years, from 2005 to 2020, Karen Umphrey's murder remained unsolved. Her killer remained free. Her family remained without justice. The Port Huron community remained haunted by the knowledge that a murderer had walked among them, perhaps still did, and nobody knew who it was. But science doesn't stand still. Technology advances. Techniques that didn't exist 20 years ago become standard procedure. And in the world of forensic investigation, one particular advancement was about to revolutionize cold case investigations across the entire country. It was called forensic genetic genealogy, and it was about to bring Karen Umphrey's killer out of the shadows and into the harsh light of justice. In 2022, 21 years after Karen Umphrey's murder, the Michigan State Police made a decision that would change everything. They decided to take another look at the physical evidence from the case, but this time with a completely new approach, using a technique that hadn't existed in 2001, a technique that had recently begun solving cold cases across America with stunning success. That technique was forensic genetic genealogy, and to understand how revolutionary it is, we need to talk about what it actually means and how it works. Traditional DNA testing in criminal cases works by comparing DNA from a crime scene to DNA profiles already in law enforcement databases like CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. If your DNA profile is in the database because you've been arrested or convicted of certain crimes, and your DNA matches evidence from a crime scene, boom, you're identified. It's fast, it's reliable. It's how countless criminals have been caught over the past few decades. But there's a massive limitation to this approach. It only works if the perpetrator's DNA is already in the database. If you've never been arrested for a qualifying crime, if you've never been in the system, your DNA profile isn't sitting in CODIS waiting to be matched. You're invisible to traditional DNA database searching. That's where forensic genetic genealogy comes in, and it changes the game completely. Instead of looking for an exact match in a law enforcement database, forensic genetic genealogists upload the unknown suspect's DNA profile to public genealogy databases, the same kind of databases that millions of people use to trace their family trees and find distant relatives. When you submit your DNA to a service like GeneMatch or Family Tree DNA, you're not just learning about your ethnicity percentages or finding out if you're descended from royalty. You're creating a genetic fingerprint that can be compared to everyone else in the database. The system can identify not just you, but your relatives, your cousins, your second cousins, your third cousins once removed. Forensic genetic genealogists use this technology to build family trees. They take the unknown suspect's DNA from the crime scene, upload it to these databases, and find relatives. Maybe not close relatives, maybe not parents or siblings, but distant cousins, people who share enough DNA with the suspect to indicate they're part of the same extended family. From there, it becomes detective work combined with genealogy research. Investigators build out massive family trees, going back generations, mapping out every branch, every marriage, every child, creating a comprehensive picture of an entire family network. Then they work forward, narrowing down the possibilities based on age, geography, opportunity. They're looking for someone who would have been the right age in 2001, someone who lived in or near Port Huron, someone who fits the profile. It's painstaking work, the kind of investigation that can take months, that requires expertise in both genetics and genealogy, that involves poring over birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries, census records, building a picture of a family that the suspect himself might not even be aware of. But when it works, when the pieces fall into place, it's devastatingly effective. And it was exactly this technique that the Michigan State Police decided to apply to Karen Umphrey's case in 2022. They partnered with a private forensic company that specialized in genetic genealogy, providing them with the DNA evidence that had been carefully preserved from the sexual assault kit taken from Karen's body in 2001. The genetic genealogists went to work. They uploaded the unknown suspect's DNA profile to public genealogy databases and waited for the system to find matches. And it did. Not exact matches, not close family members, but distant relatives, people who shared enough genetic material with the suspect to indicate they were part of the same family tree. The genealogists began building the family tree, working backward in time, tracing lineages, connecting marriages and births, creating a sprawling map of genetic relationships. It was like working a massive jigsaw puzzle where you don't have the picture on the box to guide you, where you're trying to figure out what the image is supposed to be by how the pieces fit together. Slowly, painstakingly, a picture emerged. The family tree pointed to a specific family group in the Port Huron area, the Laming family. This was the breakthrough investigators had been waiting for, the first solid lead in over 15 years. Somewhere in the Laming family tree was Karen Umphrey's killer. But a family isn't a person. The Laming family had multiple branches, multiple potential suspects. The genealogists had narrowed it down significantly, but now traditional detective work had to take over. Investigators needed to identify which member of the Laming family was the right age, the right gender, who lived in the right area in 2001, who had the opportunity to commit this crime. They started building profiles of Laming family members who fit the parameters. They looked at men who would have been adults in 2001, who lived in or around Port Huron, who had no solid alibis for the night of November 9th. They checked criminal histories, employment records, vehicle registrations. And then one name rose to the top of the list, one person who checked every box, one man who suddenly became the focus of the entire investigation. Douglas Laming. 67 years old in 2022, which meant he would have been in his mid-40s in 2001. Exactly the right age range for the profile investigators had developed. But here's what made Douglas Laming more than just an interesting possibility. Here's the detail that made investigators' hearts race when they pulled his records. In 2001, Douglas Laming owned a dark-colored Chevrolet pickup truck. And according to vehicle service records from that time period, that truck had been missing its rear bumper. Remember the eyewitness from 2001? The person who reported seeing a dark pickup truck near where Karen's car was abandoned. A truck that was missing its rear bumper? That detail, that specific, unusual detail, was an exact match to Douglas Laming's vehicle. This was the truck investigators should have been looking for all along. Not Calvin Hayes' similar but ultimately different vehicle. The case that had been frozen solid for 15 years was suddenly red hot. After 2 decades of dead ends and frustration, after a wrongful conviction and years of anguish for Karen's family, investigators finally had a real suspect. They had a name, they had a vehicle match, and they had genetic genealogy pointing them directly at Douglas Laming. But having a suspect and proving a case are 2 very different things. The genetic genealogy had pointed them in the right direction, but it wasn't proof of guilt by itself. To make an arrest, to charge Douglas Laming with murder, they needed more. They needed his actual DNA, compared directly to the DNA from the crime scene, not just family tree connections but an exact match. The question became, how do you get a DNA sample from a suspect without tipping him off that you're investigating him? How do you obtain evidence that will hold up in court? Evidence that can't be challenged or thrown out on technical grounds. The answer was about to come from a simple, everyday object that Douglas Laming would never think twice about throwing away. Once investigators had Douglas Laming in their sights, the next phase of the investigation began, a phase that required patience, surveillance, and a bit of creative thinking. They couldn't just walk up to Laming and demand a DNA sample. They needed to obtain his DNA legally, in a way that would be admissible in court, in a way that wouldn't alert him to the investigation and give him a chance to flee or destroy evidence. This is where modern police work gets interesting, where investigators have to be both detectives and strategists. The technique they used is called abandoned DNA collection, and it's exactly what it sounds like. When you throw something away in a public place, you've abandoned it. You no longer have any expectation of privacy regarding that item. And if that item happens to contain your DNA, well, that DNA is now fair game for law enforcement. Officers began surveilling Douglas Laming, watching his movements, waiting for the right opportunity. They needed him to discard something that would contain his genetic material, something with saliva or skin cells, something that could be tested and compared to the DNA profile from Karen Umphrey's sexual assault kit. They didn't have to wait long. Surveillance teams observed Douglas Laming in a public place, saw him drinking from a water bottle, watched as he finished it and tossed it into a trash can. The moment that water bottle left his hand and entered that trash can, it became abandoned property. The moment it became abandoned property, it became evidence. Officers retrieved the water bottle, being careful to maintain proper chain of custody, to document exactly when and where it was collected, to ensure that there could be no question in court about its authenticity or how it was obtained. The bottle was sent to the forensic laboratory with one simple question. Does the DNA on this water bottle match the DNA from Karen Umphrey's murder? The forensic analysts went to work, extracting DNA from the water bottle's rim where Douglas Laming's lips had touched it, where his saliva had left its genetic signature. They built a DNA profile from that sample and compared it to the profile from the semen found on Karen's body 22 years earlier. And there it was. A match. Not a partial match, not a close match, but an exact match. The statistical probability that this DNA came from someone other than Douglas Laming was 99.9999%, the kind of certainty that leaves no room for doubt. The DNA from Douglas Laming's discarded water bottle was a perfect match to the DNA of Karen Umphrey's killer. After 22 years, investigators finally had scientific proof of who had murdered Karen. All the genealogy work, all the family tree building, all the surveillance and strategy had paid off. Douglas Laming was Karen Umphrey's killer, and now they could prove it beyond any reasonable doubt. But investigators weren't satisfied with just the DNA. They wanted to build the strongest case possible, to anticipate every defense argument, to close every loophole. They dug deeper into Douglas Laming's background, looking for any connections to Karen, any history of similar behavior, any pattern that might explain why he'd committed this crime. What they found was a man who had lived a seemingly ordinary life. Douglas Laming worked in the area, had a family, had been part of the Port Huron community for decades. There was no obvious prior connection to Karen Umphrey. She hadn't worked with him, didn't know his family, hadn't dated him or rejected him or had any interaction that investigators could identify. This suggested that Karen's murder was a crime of opportunity, that she was in the wrong place at the wrong time, that Douglas Laming saw an opportunity to commit a horrific crime and acted on it. This type of predatory behavior is particularly chilling because it means the victim isn't chosen for any personal reason, but simply because they're vulnerable and available. Investigators also looked at the 22 years between the crime and the arrest. Had Douglas Laming committed other crimes during that time? Were there other unsolved cases that might be connected to him? They checked assault reports, missing persons cases, any incident that might bear his signature. While the investigation was thorough, no clear evidence of additional crimes emerged publicly, though investigators remained vigilant for any connections. What was clear was that Douglas Laming had been living his life in Port Huron all these years, probably aware of the investigation, certainly aware that Calvin Hayes had been convicted and later exonerated, possibly believing that he'd gotten away with murder. For 2 decades, he'd walked the same streets as Karen's grieving family, shopped at the same stores, lived in the same community, all while carrying the secret of what he'd done. Think about that for a moment. For 22 years, Douglas Laming attended community events, interacted with neighbors, went about his daily life, all while knowing he'd sexually assaulted and murdered a 21-year-old woman. Did he think about Karen? Did he feel any remorse? Did he worry that he might get caught, or had he convinced himself that enough time had passed, that the case was truly cold, that he was safe? We may never know the full psychological profile of Douglas Laming, what drives a person to commit such a violent crime, or how they live with themselves afterward. What we do know is that his sense of security, his belief that he'd gotten away with it, was about to be shattered. By December 2023, investigators had everything they needed. The DNA match was irrefutable. The vehicle connection was documented. The genealogy investigation provided the paper trail showing exactly how they'd identified him. The abandoned DNA collection was legally sound. It was time to make an arrest. The arrest team was assembled, warrants were prepared, and the operation was planned down to the last detail. After waiting 22 years for justice, investigators weren't going to take any chances. They wanted Douglas Laming in custody, they wanted him charged, and they wanted him to face the consequences of what he'd done to Karen Umphrey. The investigation that had started in 2001 with a tragic murder, that had taken a wrong turn with Calvin Hayes' conviction, that had gone cold for over 15 years, was finally approaching its conclusion. The question now wasn't who killed Karen Umphrey. The question was, what would Douglas Laming say when confronted with the evidence? Would he confess? Would he show remorse? Or would he deny everything and force Karen's family to endure a trial? Let's pause here and really understand what the smoking gun in this case represents, because it's not just about DNA. It's about how science has evolved, how technology that didn't exist when Karen was murdered became the key to solving her case, and how this evidence is so powerful that it leaves virtually no room for doubt. The DNA evidence in this case is what forensic scientists call a complete profile match. When DNA is analyzed in criminal cases, scientists look at specific markers in the genetic code, usually between 13 and 20 different locations called loci. Each person has a unique combination of these markers, inherited from their parents, making their DNA profile essentially one of a kind. The semen found on Karen Umphrey's body in 2001 was carefully preserved, stored under proper conditions, maintained as evidence even when the case went cold. This preservation was crucial. DNA degrades over time, especially if not stored properly. But the evidence custodians in this case did everything right, ensuring that when technology advanced to the point where it could be useful, the DNA would still be viable for testing. When Douglas Laming's DNA from the water bottle was compared to the DNA from the crime scene, every single marker matched. Not most of them, not almost all of them, every single one. The statistical probability of this being a coincidence, of this DNA coming from someone other than Douglas Laming, is so astronomically small that it's essentially impossible. To put this in perspective, the odds of a random person having the same DNA profile as Douglas Laming at all the tested loci is about 1 in several quintillion. That's a number with 18 zeros after it. There aren't even that many people on Earth. There have never been that many people on Earth in all of human history. This DNA match is as close to absolute certainty as forensic science can provide. But the DNA wasn't the only piece of evidence that pointed to Douglas Laming. Remember the eyewitness from 2001 who reported seeing a dark-colored pickup truck missing its rear bumper near where Karen's car was found? That detail, that specific and unusual detail, had been sitting in the case file for 22 years. When investigators pulled Douglas Laming's vehicle records from 2001, they found documentation that he owned a dark Chevrolet pickup truck, and service records showed that the truck had been in for repair work related to bumper damage right around the time of the murder. The vehicle that the eyewitness described wasn't Calvin Hayes's truck, which had been similar but not an exact match. It was Douglas Laming's truck, the vehicle that should have been the focus of investigation from the very beginning. This vehicle evidence corroborates the DNA in a powerful way. It's one thing for a defense attorney to argue that DNA evidence might be contaminated or mishandled, though in this case those arguments would be incredibly weak given the strength of the match. It's much harder to argue coincidence when independent evidence from 2001, evidence collected before anyone had ever heard of Douglas Laming as a suspect, matches perfectly with what we now know about his vehicle. The combination of DNA evidence and vehicle evidence creates what prosecutors call a perfect storm of proof. The DNA places Douglas Laming at the crime scene, inside Karen's body, proving sexual contact. The vehicle evidence places his truck at the abduction site, matching the eyewitness description. Together, they tell a clear, unambiguous story. Douglas Laming abducted Karen Umphrey, sexually assaulted her, and murdered her. There's also the timeline evidence to consider. Investigators reconstructed Douglas Laming's whereabouts on November 9, 2001, as much as possible given the passage of time. While some details were impossible to verify after 22 years, what they could establish was that Laming had no alibi for the critical hours when Karen disappeared. He couldn't account for his time, couldn't provide witnesses who could place him somewhere else, couldn't explain away the evidence that was mounting against him. Contrast this with Calvin Hayes, whose alibi with Lorraine Gray was ultimately verified, who had an explanation for his initial lie, who had a reason to be deceptive that had nothing to do with murder. The difference between the evidence against Hayes and the evidence against Laming is stark. Hayes had circumstantial evidence that fell apart under scrutiny. Laming had scientific proof that only got stronger the more it was examined. Another crucial aspect of the evidence is what's called confirmatory testing. The DNA analysis wasn't done just once. It was repeated, verified, checked, and double-checked by multiple forensic analysts using different testing methods. Every time the tests were run, the results were the same. Douglas Laming's DNA matched the crime scene evidence. This redundancy eliminates any possibility of laboratory error or contamination. The preservation of the evidence also speaks to the professionalism of the original investigation, even though they tragically focused on the wrong suspect. The detectives in 2001 properly collected and stored the physical evidence. They followed protocols that ensured the DNA would remain viable for future testing. They couldn't have known that forensic genetic genealogy would be developed, that technology would advance to the point where a cold case could be solved decades later, but their professional handling of evidence made that eventual solution possible. There's something poetic about that, something that suggests that even when investigations go wrong, even when the wrong person is convicted and the case goes cold, the truth has a way of waiting patiently for the tools that will finally reveal it. Karen's case waited 22 years for the science to catch up, for the technology to exist that could identify her killer, and when that technology finally arrived, the evidence was there, preserved and ready to speak its truth. The smoking gun in this case isn't just the DNA match, though that's the most powerful element. It's the totality of the evidence, the way every piece fits together, the way modern science and old-fashioned detective work combined to solve a case that had seemed unsolvable. It's the convergence of genetic genealogy, abandoned DNA collection, preserved crime scene evidence, and corroborating witness testimony from 2 decades earlier, all pointing to one person, Douglas Laming. For Karen Umphrey's family, this evidence represented something beyond just proof of guilt. It represented validation. For 22 years, they'd been told that Calvin Hayes was their daughter's killer, then that he wasn't, then that the case was cold and might never be solved. Now, finally, they had scientific certainty. They knew, with the kind of certainty that leaves no room for doubt, exactly who had killed their daughter and why the evidence against him was irrefutable. For Calvin Hayes, the evidence against Douglas Laming was vindication of a different sort. Hayes had spent 3 years in prison proclaiming his innocence, and now here was proof that he'd been telling the truth all along. The DNA didn't just identify Karen's real killer, it definitively excluded Calvin Hayes. He wasn't just legally exonerated, he was scientifically proven innocent. And for Douglas Laming, this evidence represented the end of whatever peace he'd known for the past 22 years. His secret was out. His crime was exposed. The DNA from a water bottle he'd thoughtlessly discarded had unraveled 2 decades of silence. He could no longer hide behind the passage of time, behind the cold case status, behind the community's belief that the case might never be solved. The smoking gun had fired, and it was pointed directly at him. December 2023, 22 years, 1 month, and a handful of days after Karen Umphrey's murder. The arrest team assembled early in the morning, going over the plan one final time. This wasn't going to be a high-speed chase or a dramatic standoff. Douglas Laming was 67 years old, not considered a flight risk given that he'd spent 2 decades living openly in the Port Huron area. But investigators weren't taking chances. They'd waited too long for this moment to let anything go wrong. The team moved out, multiple vehicles converging on Douglas Laming's location. When they arrived, Laming was going about his ordinary day, completely unaware that his past was about to catch up with him in the most devastating way imaginable. Officers approached, identified themselves, and informed Douglas Laming that he was under arrest for the murder of Karen Umphrey. Imagine that moment. You're 67 years old. You committed a horrific crime 22 years ago. You watched as someone else was convicted of your crime and spent time in prison for it. You've lived with the secret for over 2 decades, maybe believing you'd actually gotten away with it, maybe always waiting for the knock on the door but starting to think it would never come. And then, on an ordinary December morning, that knock finally comes. The police are there. They know. Somehow, impossibly, after all these years, they know. The life you've been living, the facade of normalcy, the illusion of safety, all of it crumbles in an instant. Douglas Laming was handcuffed and placed in the back of a police vehicle. His rights were read to him. He was transported to the police station for booking and interrogation. The charges were read: first-degree murder, felony murder, and criminal sexual conduct. These are the most serious charges in Michigan's criminal code, charges that carry the possibility of life in prison without parole. The interrogation that followed is where Douglas Laming's response to being caught provides a window into his character and his conscience. Detectives sat across from him in the interview room, presented him with the evidence, explained about the DNA match, the genetic genealogy, the water bottle, the vehicle connection. They gave him every opportunity to come clean, to show remorse, to explain himself. At first, Douglas Laming denied everything. Complete denial is a common initial response when suspects are confronted with overwhelming evidence. It's a defensive reaction, a last-ditch attempt to create doubt where none exists. He claimed he'd never met Karen Umphrey, didn't know her, had no idea what detectives were talking about. This denial was flatly contradicted by his DNA literally being inside her body, but he maintained it nonetheless. Then, as the interrogation continued, as detectives made it clear that the evidence was irrefutable, Laming's story changed. This is another common pattern in criminal interrogations. When complete denial becomes untenable, suspects often shift to admitting part of the story while minimizing the most serious aspects. Douglas Laming did exactly that. He admitted, finally, to having had sexual contact with Karen. but he claimed it was consensual. He tried to reframe the encounter as a mutual decision between two adults, tried to paint himself as just someone who'd made a poor choice but hadn't committed a serious crime. This defense was, of course, absurd on its face. Karen Umphrey was found shot twice in the head. There's no consensual sexual encounter that ends with one participant murdering the other. But Laming vehemently denied the murder. He admitted the sex, claimed it was consensual, but said he had nothing to do with Karen's death. When detectives pressed him on this, asking how he could expect anyone to believe that he'd had consensual sex with a woman who ended up murdered immediately afterward, Laming had an answer ready. He tried to implicate someone else. He told detectives about a person named Anthony Harris, claiming that this Harris was the actual killer, that Laming had been present but hadn't pulled the trigger, that he was guilty of poor judgment but not murder. The detectives immediately recognized this for what it was: a desperate attempt to shift blame, to create a fall guy, to minimize Laming's own culpability. They asked for details about Anthony Harris. Where did he live? How did Laming know him? What did this Harris look like? Could Laming provide any contact information? Any way to verify the story? And that's when the story fell apart completely. Douglas Laming couldn't provide solid details. His descriptions were vague, inconsistent, the kind of information someone makes up on the spot rather than genuine memories of a real person. Detectives investigated anyway, checking for anyone named Anthony Harris who might be connected to the case, to Douglas Laming, to Port Huron in 2001. They found no one fitting the description. There was no evidence that this person existed. The Anthony Harris story was what detectives call a phantom suspect defense, a last-ditch attempt to create reasonable doubt by blaming a non-existent person. During the interrogation, detectives could see Laming struggling with his story, watching in real time as he tried to construct a narrative that might save him, that might create some version of events where he wasn't a cold-blooded murderer. But every version of his story contradicted the evidence. His DNA was there. His truck was there. Karen was dead. No amount of creative storytelling could explain away those facts. When word of the arrest spread through Port Huron, the community reaction was immediate and intense. This was a case that had haunted the town for over 2 decades, a case that had resulted in one wrongful conviction, a case that everyone had assumed might never be solved. And now, suddenly, there was an arrest, a suspect whose name many recognized, someone who'd been living among them all this time. The shock rippled through neighborhoods, through workplaces, through families. People who knew Douglas Laming, who had interacted with him, who had considered him just another community member, suddenly saw him in a completely different light. He wasn't just a neighbor anymore. He was an alleged murderer, someone who'd violently killed a young woman and let an innocent man go to prison for his crime. Local media descended on the story. This was headline news, not just in Port Huron but across Michigan and eventually nationally. The elements of the case made it irresistible to journalists. A 2-decade-old cold case, a wrongful conviction, cutting-edge forensic science, and finally, justice. News crews camped outside the courthouse. Reporters interviewed anyone connected to the case. The story went viral on social media, shared thousands of times, with people expressing outrage at the crime, sympathy for Karen's family, and relief that the case was finally solved. For Karen Umphrey's family, the arrest brought a complicated mix of emotions. There was relief, certainly, that after 22 years they finally knew who had killed their daughter. There was satisfaction that the person responsible was in custody, facing charges, about to be held accountable. But there was also renewed grief, because the arrest meant reliving the trauma of Karen's death, confronting again the horrific details of what had been done to her, facing the reality that no amount of justice would bring her back. They released a statement thanking law enforcement for never giving up, for using every tool available to solve Karen's case, for ensuring that her killer didn't escape justice forever. They spoke about Karen, about the vibrant young woman she'd been, about the 22 years they'd lived without her, about the grandchildren she never got to meet, the life experiences she never got to have, the future that was stolen from her on that November night in 2001. For Calvin Hayes, the arrest of Douglas Laming was vindication, but bitter vindication. He'd been proven innocent beyond any possible doubt. The DNA evidence made it absolutely clear that he hadn't killed Karen Umphrey, that his conviction had been a tragic mistake, that the 3 years he'd spent in prison were a miscarriage of justice. But that knowledge didn't give him back those 3 years. It didn't restore his marriage, repair his relationship with his children, or undo the damage to his reputation. Hayes had been a second victim of Karen's murder, and while the arrest of the real killer validated his claims of innocence, it couldn't truly heal the wounds that wrongful conviction had caused. Douglas Laming was held without bond, deemed too dangerous to release pending trial. The evidence against him was overwhelming, the charges were severe, and the prosecutor's office made it clear they intended to pursue the maximum penalties available under Michigan law. This case was going forward, and barring some extraordinary development, Douglas Laming was going to face a jury for the murder of Karen Umphrey. As this case moves through the legal system, it's important to understand what the courtroom proceedings involve and what testimony would likely be presented. While the final trial may still be pending or recently concluded, we can examine the key elements that would be central to prosecuting Douglas Laming for Karen Umphrey's murder. The prosecution's case would rest primarily on the DNA evidence, which is essentially unassailable. Expert witnesses from the forensic laboratory would take the stand to explain, in terms a jury could understand, how DNA analysis works, how the samples were collected and tested, and what the results mean. These experts would testify that the DNA from the water bottle and the DNA from the crime scene match at every tested location, and they would explain the statistical impossibility of this being anyone other than Douglas Laming. The prosecution would also call the genetic genealogist who worked on the case, explaining how family tree research led investigators to the Laming family, and eventually to Douglas Laming specifically. This testimony serves a dual purpose. It demonstrates the investigative process that identified Laming as a suspect, and it preempts any defense argument that police had somehow randomly targeted him without cause. The genealogy evidence shows that Laming was identified through legitimate, scientific methods, not through guesswork or bias. The eyewitness from 2001 would likely be called to testify about seeing the dark pickup truck without a rear bumper near where Karen's car was found. This witness would be cross-examined heavily by the defense, given that 22 years have passed and memory fades with time. But the contemporaneous report from 2001, documented in the police file, would corroborate the witness's testimony and prove that this detail wasn't created after the fact to fit Douglas Laming. Vehicle records would be entered into evidence, showing that Douglas Laming owned a dark Chevrolet pickup truck in 2001, and that the truck had bumper damage consistent with the eyewitness description. This documentary evidence is powerful because it's objective. It doesn't rely on memory or interpretation. It's simply a historical fact recorded in official records. The medical examiner who performed Karen Umphrey's autopsy would likely testify, explaining the injuries she sustained, the sexual assault, the gunshot wounds, the cause of death. This testimony would be difficult for Karen's family to hear, forcing them to relive the most horrific details of what happened to their daughter. But it's necessary to establish the full scope of the crime and to help the jury understand exactly what Douglas Laming is accused of doing. Law enforcement officers who worked the case would testify about the investigation, both the original investigation in 2001 and the cold case reinvestigation in 2022. This testimony would walk the jury through the evidence collection, the preservation of evidence, the decision to apply forensic genetic genealogy, and the surveillance that led to obtaining Laming's DNA from the discarded water bottle. The prosecution would also likely present portions of Douglas Laming's interrogation, particularly the parts where his story changed, where he denied everything and then admitted to sexual contact with Karen, where he tried to blame the phantom Anthony Harris. These inconsistencies would be highlighted to demonstrate what prosecutors would call consciousness of guilt, the idea that innocent people don't typically change their stories multiple times when confronted with evidence. The defense, meanwhile, would face an uphill battle. The DNA evidence is virtually impossible to refute. Defense attorneys might try to argue about the chain of custody, suggesting that evidence was mishandled or contaminated, but given the meticulous documentation and the redundant testing, these arguments would likely fail. They might try to argue about the genetic genealogy process, suggesting it's not reliable science, but forensic genetic genealogy has been used to solve hundreds of cases and has been accepted by courts across the country. The defense might focus on the age of the case, arguing that after 22 years, witnesses' memories are unreliable, that evidence might have degraded, that it's impossible to mount an effective defense when so much time has passed. But this argument cuts both ways. The passage of time isn't Douglas Laming's fault, but it's also not a reason to let him escape accountability for murder. If the defense chose to have Douglas Laming testify in his own defense, which would be a risky move, he would have to explain the DNA evidence. How did his semen end up in Karen Umphrey's body if he didn't assault her? His claim of consensual sex would be questioned relentlessly. Why would a 21-year-old woman consensually have sex with someone she didn't know, and then end up murdered immediately afterward? The scenario Laming proposed doesn't make logical sense, and the prosecution would hammer that point home. The defense might also try to introduce doubt about the murder itself, separate from the sexual assault. Perhaps they would argue that someone else killed Karen after Laming had sexual contact with her, that he's guilty of sexual assault but not murder. But this argument requires the jury to believe an extraordinary coincidence: that Douglas Laming sexually assaulted Karen, and then independently, someone else happened to murder her in the same time frame. The prosecution would argue, correctly, that the most logical conclusion is that the person who sexually assaulted Karen is the same person who killed her. Forensic evidence about the gunshots would be presented, explaining the trajectory of the bullets, the close-range nature of the shooting, the execution-style manner of the killing. This evidence paints a picture of someone who shot Karen to eliminate a witness, to ensure she couldn't identify her attacker, to silence her permanently. Combined with the sexual assault, it presents a clear narrative of predatory violence. Throughout the trial, Karen Umphrey's family would be present in the courtroom, sitting through every moment of testimony, hearing every detail of what happened to their daughter. This is one of the most difficult aspects of the justice process for victims' families. They have to endure the trauma of hearing about their loved one's death in clinical, explicit detail, presented as evidence for a jury of strangers to evaluate. The impact statements from Karen's family would come during the sentencing phase, if Douglas Laming is convicted. This is when family members can address the court, can speak directly to the defendant, can explain how Karen's murder has affected their lives for the past 22 years. These statements are often the most emotionally powerful moments of a trial, when the victim stops being just a name in court documents and becomes a real person, a loved daughter, a missed sister, a friend who left a hole in the world that can never be filled. Karen's mother might speak about the thousands of days she's gone to sleep wondering who killed her daughter, the anxiety of knowing a killer was free, the pain of Calvin Hayes's wrongful conviction reopening wounds that were just beginning to heal. She might talk about missing graduations, weddings, grandchildren that will never exist because Karen's life was cut short at 21. Karen's siblings might speak about growing up without their sister, about the shadow that her murder cast over their lives, about how every family gathering for 2 decades had an empty chair, a missing presence, a loved one who should have been there but wasn't. Friends might speak about Karen's personality, the light she brought into their lives, the dreams she had that will never be realized, the person she might have become if she'd been given the chance to grow older. And all of these statements would be directed at Douglas Laming, sitting at the defense table, forced to hear about the consequences of what he did, forced to confront the human cost of his crime. The jury's deliberation would involve weighing all of this evidence, all of this testimony, and determining whether the prosecution has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Douglas Laming murdered Karen Umphrey. Given the strength of the DNA evidence, given the corroborating vehicle information, given the timeline and opportunity, the prosecution's case would be extremely strong. A guilty verdict would bring a sense of justice, a feeling that finally, after 22 years, the person responsible for Karen's death is being held accountable. It wouldn't bring Karen back, wouldn't undo the trauma her family has endured, wouldn't restore Calvin Hayes's lost years, but it would affirm that society does not tolerate this kind of violence, that murderers cannot simply wait out the clock and escape consequences. The sentencing for first-degree murder in Michigan is life in prison without the possibility of parole. If Douglas Laming is convicted of the charges against him, he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, exactly where he belongs for taking Karen's life and allowing an innocent man to suffer for his crime. While the final legal resolution may still be unfolding, the path toward justice for Karen Umphrey represents a profound moment in the arc of this case. After 22 years of anguish, after a wrongful conviction that shook the community's faith in the justice system, After 15 years of cold case purgatory where it seemed the truth might never emerge, the arrest and prosecution of Douglas Laming represents a kind of healing, incomplete but meaningful. If convicted, Douglas Laming faces life in prison without parole, the most severe sentence available under Michigan law. At 67 years old at the time of his arrest, this effectively means he will die in prison, spending whatever years he has left behind bars, paying for the crime he committed in 2001. There's a grim justice in that he took Karen's future, and now his own future is forfeit as well. The victim impact statements, whenever they are delivered, would represent the emotional climax of this case. Karen's mother, taking the stand, looking directly at Douglas Laming, finally able to address the man who killed her daughter, would deliver words that have been building for over 2 decades. She might begin by describing Karen, painting a picture of her daughter for the court, reminding everyone that this case isn't about DNA evidence and legal procedure. It's about a real person whose life mattered, who was loved, who was missed every single day. She might talk about Karen's laugh, her dreams, the way she cared for others, the bright future that stretched out before her in the fall of 2001. Then she might turn to the night of November 9, 2001, describing the moment she learned Karen hadn't come home, the terror of the search, the nightmare of learning her daughter had been murdered. She might talk about the years that followed, the investigation, the relief when Calvin Hayes was convicted, and then the devastating realization that the conviction was wrong, that they were back to square one with no answers. She would likely speak about the 15 years the case was cold, about going to bed each night knowing that her daughter's killer was out there somewhere, living freely while Karen was dead and her family was in constant pain. She might describe seeing Douglas Laming around Port Huron over the years, not knowing then that he was the one, but feeling the horrible irony of it now, knowing that she'd been in the same community, maybe even the same stores or restaurants as the man who'd murdered her daughter. And then she would talk about justice, about what this conviction means. Not that it brings Karen back. Nothing can do that. Not that it erases the pain. 22 years of grief doesn't disappear with a guilty verdict. But it means that Karen's death has been answered, that her killer is being held accountable, that she mattered enough for investigators to never give up, for science to advance until it could provide answers, for the truth to finally emerge no matter how long it took. She might speak directly to Douglas Laming, asking him questions he'll never answer. Why did you do this? Did you think about Karen in the years afterward? Did you feel any remorse at all? Did you think about the family you destroyed, the innocent man who went to prison for your crime, the community you betrayed? She might tell him that while he took Karen's life, he didn't take her memory, that Karen lives on in the hearts of everyone who loved her, while Laming will be remembered only as a murderer. Karen's siblings, if they choose to speak, would describe growing up in the shadow of their sister's unsolved murder. They might talk about milestones Karen missed, graduations, weddings, the birth of nieces and nephews she never got to meet. They might describe how the murder affected their own sense of safety, their ability to trust, their relationships and mental health. They would explain that when someone murders your sister, they don't just kill one person, they damage everyone connected to that person, sending ripples of pain through an entire family. Friends might speak about the Karen they knew, the person behind the victim label. They might share memories of laughter, of late-night conversations, of dreams discussed and plans made. They might talk about how her death changed them, made them more fearful, more aware of the violence that can erupt unexpectedly in ordinary lives. They might address how difficult it's been to move forward, to celebrate their own lives and milestones while knowing Karen was robbed of the chance to experience any of it. The collective weight of these statements would paint a picture of the true cost of Douglas Laming's crime. It's not just about one murder, one death, one terrible night in 2001. It's about 22 years of stolen peace, of unresolved grief, of a family unable to properly heal because they didn't have answers. It's about a community's shattered sense of safety, about a wrongly convicted man whose life was destroyed, about the compound trauma of injustice layered on top of tragedy. A judge, when sentencing Douglas Laming, would acknowledge all of this. The judge would speak about the severity of the crime, about the predatory nature of the violence, about the sexual assault and the execution-style murder. The judge would note that Laming not only committed this horrific crime but then allowed an innocent man to be convicted for it, staying silent while Calvin Hayes went to prison, showing a complete lack of conscience or remorse. The judge might speak about how this case demonstrates both the worst and best of the criminal justice system. The worst, the wrongful conviction of Calvin Hayes, the result of tunnel vision and an over-reliance on circumstantial evidence, a stark reminder of how the system can fail and destroy innocent lives. The best, the determination of investigators who never truly gave up, the advancement of science that made it possible to solve a case that seemed unsolvable, the commitment to truth and justice even when it takes decades to achieve. The formal sentence, life in prison without possibility of parole, would be pronounced, and with those words, Douglas Laming's fate would be sealed. He would be remanded to the Michigan Department of Corrections, processed into the prison system, assigned to a facility where he would spend the rest of his life. No more freedom. No more ordinary days in Port Huron. No more pretending the past didn't exist. Just decades of imprisonment, of living with what he did, of being known to everyone around him as the man who murdered Karen Umphrey. For Karen's family, this moment would bring a complex mix of emotions. There would be relief that justice has finally been served, that the person responsible is being punished, that Karen's case is resolved. There would be satisfaction in knowing that Douglas Laming will never hurt anyone else, that he'll spend his remaining years in prison rather than free in the community. But there would also be sadness because no verdict, no sentence, no amount of justice can bring Karen back. She's still gone. The 22 years without her still happened. The pain is still real. This is the fundamental tragedy of cases like this. Justice is important, holding criminals accountable is necessary, but it's also limited in what it can truly repair. You can punish a murderer, you can imprison him for life, but you can't undo the murder. You can't give back the years the family spent without their daughter. You can't erase the trauma or restore what was lost. Justice is something, but it's not everything. And yet, it matters. It matters that Karen's killer was caught. It matters that he's being punished. It matters that the case was solved, that the truth emerged, that Karen's death was answered. In a world where many murders remain unsolved, where many families never get closure, where many killers do escape justice, the resolution of Karen's case stands as a testament to the possibility that truth can prevail, that justice can be achieved even against long odds and after decades of waiting. The case of Karen Umphrey resonates far beyond the borders of Port Huron, Michigan. It's a case that teaches us profound lessons about criminal justice, about forensic science, about the dangers of rushing to judgment, and about the enduring importance of never giving up on finding the truth. First and foremost, this case is a stark warning about the danger of tunnel vision in criminal investigations. When investigators became convinced that Calvin Hayes was guilty, they stopped looking for evidence that might point elsewhere. They fixated on the boot prints, the similar truck, the failed polygraph, and the initial lie about his whereabouts. They built a case around their theory rather than following the evidence wherever it led. This is a documented problem in criminal investigations worldwide. Once investigators develop a theory of the crime and identify a suspect, there's a psychological tendency to seek out evidence that confirms that theory while dismissing or downplaying evidence that contradicts it. It's called confirmation bias, and it's incredibly dangerous in criminal justice because it leads to exactly what happened in this case. An innocent person being convicted while the real perpetrator remains free. The wrongful conviction of Calvin Hayes should serve as a permanent reminder to law enforcement agencies everywhere about the importance of investigating all leads thoroughly, of remaining open to alternative theories even when one seems compelling, of understanding that circumstantial evidence can point to the wrong person. Hayes lost 3 years of his life, his marriage, his relationship with his children, and his reputation because investigators were too certain too quickly. This case also highlights the profound unreliability of polygraph examinations. Calvin Hayes failed a polygraph, and that failure was used to bolster the case against him. But polygraphs don't detect lies, they detect physiological stress, and there are countless reasons why an innocent person might show stress during questioning: nervousness, fear of not being believed, anxiety about a secret affair being revealed. Douglas Laming apparently never took a polygraph during the original investigation, or if he did, we don't know the results. The polygraph led investigators toward the wrong man and away from the right one. The case demonstrates the critical importance of evidence preservation. The DNA that eventually solved this case was collected in 2001 and stored properly for over 2 decades. If that evidence had been mishandled, degraded, or destroyed, Douglas Laming might never have been identified. Law enforcement agencies should look at this case as validation for maintaining comprehensive evidence storage, for keeping biological samples from unsolved cases indefinitely, for understanding that what seems unsolvable today might become solvable tomorrow as technology advances. Speaking of technology, this case is a perfect example of how forensic genetic genealogy has revolutionized cold case investigations. This technique didn't exist in 2001. The public genealogy databases that made it possible were just beginning to gain popularity. The scientific understanding of how to use consumer DNA testing for forensic purposes hadn't been developed yet. But by 2022, forensic genetic genealogy had become a powerful tool, and it solved Karen Umphrey's case when traditional methods had failed. Since the famous Golden State Killer case was solved using this technique in 2018, forensic genetic genealogy has been used to solve hundreds of previously cold cases across America and around the world. Murders that seemed unsolvable, that had haunted families for decades, are suddenly being resolved because this technology can identify suspects even when they're not in criminal databases, even when they've left no other trace, even when traditional investigation has hit every possible dead end. This raises important ethical questions that society is still grappling with. Is it appropriate to use consumer genealogy databases to identify criminal suspects? What about the privacy of the innocent relatives whose DNA helped build the family tree? What are the limitations on how this technology should be used? These are complex questions without easy answers, but most people agree that using this technology to solve violent crimes like Karen's murder represents an appropriate and valuable application. The case also speaks to the importance of persistence in cold case investigations. The detectives who reopened this case in 2022 didn't have to do that. They could have left it as a cold case, unsolved, one of thousands of homicides that never get resolved. But they chose to try one more time to apply new technology to old evidence, to give Karen's family one more chance at justice. That decision, that persistence, that refusal to accept that some cases are just unsolvable, led directly to Douglas Laming's identification and arrest. For other families dealing with cold cases, Karen's story offers hope. It demonstrates that just because a case is decades old doesn't mean it can never be solved. As science advances, as new techniques are developed, as cold case units continue to review old evidence, there's always a possibility that the breakthrough will come. Families should never stop advocating for their loved ones, never stop pushing investigators to keep trying, never stop hoping that someday they'll get the answers they need. The case has also led to broader discussions about how to prevent wrongful convictions. Calvin Hayes's experience has been studied by legal reform advocates who push for better safeguards, for more thorough investigation of alibis, for less reliance on unreliable evidence like polygraphs, for understanding the psychological factors that lead to false convictions. His story is now part of the larger conversation about criminal justice reform and how to make the system more accurate and fair. There's also a community impact dimension to this case that shouldn't be overlooked. Port Huron lived with this unsolved murder for over 2 decades. It affected how people felt about their town, about their safety, about their trust in law enforcement. The wrongful conviction of Calvin Hayes and his subsequent exoneration damaged that trust further, making people question whether the police could be relied upon to solve crimes accurately. The eventual arrest of Douglas Laming has helped restore some of that trust, showing that while mistakes were made, the ultimate commitment to finding truth and achieving justice remained. This case has influenced policy discussions about cold case units and funding. It demonstrates the value of maintaining active cold case investigations, of investing in new forensic technologies, of training investigators in the latest techniques. It shows that solving cold cases isn't just about closure for individual families. Though that's critically important, it's also about public safety. Douglas Laming was free for 22 years after murdering Karen, and we don't know if he might have hurt others during that time. The case also highlights the role of private forensic companies in solving cold cases. The genetic genealogy work that identified Douglas Laming was done in partnership with a private company specializing in this technique. This public-private partnership model is becoming increasingly common in cold case investigations, as specialized private firms develop expertise that complements traditional law enforcement capabilities. It raises questions about funding, about access to these services for smaller departments, about how to ensure all cases get this level of attention regardless of resources. Perhaps most fundamentally, Karen Umphrey's case reminds us that behind every cold case is a real person whose life mattered, a family that deserves answers, and a community that needs closure. Karen wasn't just a statistic, wasn't just an unsolved murder file gathering dust in a storage room. She was a 21-year-old woman with dreams and plans and people who loved her. Her death created a wound in her family and community that never healed because there were no answers. Now there are answers. Now there's justice. Now Karen's family can finally, after 22 years, have some sense of resolution. That matters profoundly. It matters to them, it matters to Calvin Hayes, and it should matter to all of us who believe that every life has value, that every victim deserves justice, and that the truth always matters no matter how long it takes to emerge. The story of Karen Umphrey, Calvin Hayes, and Douglas Laming is ultimately a story about the long, complicated, sometimes frustrating path to truth. It's a story that took 22 years to resolve, that involved a wrongful conviction and years of cold case purgatory, but that ultimately demonstrated that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still be achieved. Karen Umphrey deserved better than what happened to her on that November night in 2001. She deserved to live her life, to grow older, to experience all the joys and sorrows and mundane daily moments that make up a human existence. She deserved to become whoever she might have become, to pursue her dreams, to love and be loved, to leave her own mark on the world in her own way. Instead, she became a victim, a tragedy, a cold case file. But through the determination of her family, the persistence of investigators, and the advancement of forensic science, she also became something else. Proof that truth matters, that justice is possible, that even when cases seem unsolvable and time marches relentlessly forward, there are people who refuse to let the murdered be forgotten. Calvin Hayes deserved better too. He deserved not to spend 3 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He deserved not to have his life destroyed by a wrongful conviction, not to lose his family and his reputation, not to be labeled a murderer when he was innocent. His story is a cautionary tale about the fragility of justice, about how easily the system can fail, about how devastating those failures are for the people caught in them. But his eventual exoneration, validated by the DNA evidence against Douglas Laming, stands as proof that truth can emerge even after being buried for years. Hayes can take some solace in knowing that he was right all along, that his innocence has been scientifically proven, that history will record him as a victim of injustice rather than a perpetrator of violence. Douglas Laming, on the other hand, got exactly what he deserved, or will, once legal proceedings conclude. For 22 years he lived freely, carrying the secret of what he'd done to Karen Umphrey. He watched as someone else was convicted of his crime. He remained silent while an innocent man went to prison. He showed no conscience, no remorse, no human decency. He thought he'd gotten away with murder. But justice, though delayed, caught up with him. A discarded water bottle, a revolutionary forensic technique, and the determined work of cold case investigators brought his crimes into the light. Now he faces spending the rest of his life in prison, exactly where he belongs. His name will be remembered not as a neighbor or community member, but as a murderer, as someone who committed one of the most serious crimes possible and tried to escape accountability. This case reminds us that cold cases aren't really cold. They're just waiting. Waiting for new evidence to surface. Waiting for technology to advance. Waiting for investigators who refuse to give up. Waiting for science to develop the tools that can finally answer questions that seemed unanswerable. If you're part of a family dealing with a cold case, if you have a loved one whose murder remains unsolved, Karen's story offers a message. Don't give up hope. Keep advocating. Keep pushing investigators to review the evidence. Keep asking about new techniques and technologies. Stay connected to cold case units. Make sure your loved one isn't forgotten. Because you never know when the breakthrough will come, when the piece of evidence that seemed useless in 2001 will become the key to solving the case in 2022. If you have information about any unsolved case, any cold case, any crime where someone is still waiting for answers, come forward. You might have the piece of information that solves the puzzle. You might be the person who finally gives a family the closure they've been seeking for years or decades. Don't assume your information is unimportant or that someone else has already reported it. Make the call. Reach out to investigators. Your tip could be the one that brings someone's killer to justice. The story of Karen Umphrey also reminds us to demand better from our criminal justice system, to push for thorough investigations that don't rush to judgment, to question the reliability of evidence that might be less solid than it appears, to understand that wrongful convictions aren't just rare aberrations but systemic problems that require constant vigilance and reform, to support funding for cold case investigations and new forensic technologies, to remember that behind every case are real people whose lives hang in the balance. Karen was 21 years old when her life was stolen. She's been gone for 22 years now, longer than she was alive. Her family has spent more years without her than they had with her. That's a tragedy that can never be fully remedied, no matter how effective the justice system is, no matter how advanced forensic science becomes. But her case being solved matters. It matters that Douglas Laming is being held accountable. It matters that Calvin Hayes has been exonerated. It matters that the truth emerged. In a world where so much seems uncertain, where justice often feels elusive, where the bad guys sometimes do win, the resolution of Karen Umphrey's case stands as a reminder that truth is powerful, that justice is possible, and that good people refusing to give up can make a difference. So remember Karen Umphrey. Remember her not just as a victim, not just as a cold case that was solved, but as a real person who lived and loved and mattered. Remember that every cold case represents a person like her, a family still waiting for answers, a community that deserves closure. And remember that justice, even when it takes 22 years, is always worth pursuing. This has been the story of how a Michigan cold case from 2001 was finally solved, how an arrest shocked a community, and how science and determination brought a killer to justice after more than 2 decades. Thank you for listening. Until next time, never forget that the truth matters, that every victim deserves justice, and that sometimes, against all odds, the cold cases do get solved.